the portion of the money going towards mental health in the NHS budget is still a fraction of the NHS budget.
He was involved in setting up the all-party mental health group, which, as he's not a member of Parliament, was quite unusual. And we persuaded Norman Lamb, the Liberal MP, who is probably one of the best public health ministers that we've had in recent years. And
far too often in politics and elsewhere, there are forces and individuals who would seek to divide and actually say that actually politicians don't all get along. But actually, you're highlighting that it's not just the case.
Also, we on the second most popular podcast in the country. But we had George Mitchell on, who was the Northern Ireland Peace Envoy. And there was a time when he was the Democrat leader in the Senate, and he told us this story about when he first got elevated to that position, very young. I think he was probably late 30s, early 40s. And Bob Dole was the Republican leader.
The Unlikely Alliance with Johnson Situ. Bridging differences, sparking conversations.
Today, I'm really excited about today's episode of The Unlikely Alliance. And we are joined by Alastair Campbell and the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP. Alastair Campbell is a prominent figure in British politics and media, best known for his role as Director of Communication and Strategy in a new Labour government. His career spans journalism, political strategy, campaigner, and as an author. And he remains a significant commentator on current affairs. Notably, he is well known for co-hosting the very popular and award-winning, can I say, The Rest is Politics. We're also joined by the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP, who was recently been Shadow Foreign Secretary, but before that held several senior positions in the last Conservative government, including Deputy Foreign Secretary, International Development Secretary, Chief Whip, and a Minister of State for International Development for Africa, and also in the FCDO. An accomplished author before politics, he served in the army as a UN peacekeeper before joining the International Investment Bank, Lazard. Thank you, Andrew and Alastair.
Hello.
Good afternoon.
So before we get started, today's going to be a really interesting episode because we're exploring the personal journeys of Alastair and Andrew, two individuals who have come together to campaign on mental health. And despite having very different political backgrounds, it's probably fair to say, it's fascinating to think about how both of your careers have crossed paths, particularly on this important cause. And what's compelling, particularly for me, and I'm looking forward to exploring, is not just your individual stories, but how you've combined to campaign together on this important issue. So I wanted to start there, really. What in your personal journey and story led you to identify mental health as an important campaign for you? And I'll start off with Andrew, if that's all right.
Well, I suppose it goes back to the time when I remember ringing Alastair to ask his advice on this issue because I was suffering from mental ill health, and I went through a process and I was sorted out and I was absolutely fine. But I knew that Alastair was the master of this issue, really, and particularly because he had been brave enough, much braver than me, to talk about the impact on his own life and on his family and so on. And so that's really how we got involved specifically on that. But we knew each other. We'd known each other since we were at university together, although we didn't really know each other at university. He used to play football and drink, and I was
studious.
I was exploring university politics, and having come from the army and a boys' public school, getting to know members of the opposite sex. So we didn't really bump into each other much at Cambridge, but we knew each other quite well. I remember when he wrote his first volume of diaries.
Yeah.
I thought I'll take it on a plane and flick through it, but actually it was completely absorbing. And I read all his diaries, and indeed I'm in this as a footnote. because he refers to Andrew Mitchell on something or other. And if you look at the footnote, it says Andrew Mitchell is Alastair's Tory friend. At the bottom of the
Claim to fame, again.
So we've always done, but then he was involved in setting up the all-party mental health group, which, as he's not a member of Parliament, was quite unusual. And we persuaded Norman Lamb, the Liberal MP, who is probably one of the best public health ministers that we've had in recent years. And the three of us set out, really under Alastair's guidance, to build the campaign. And I think it was really under Alastair, because my only contribution, I think, was persuading General David Richards, to come on board. And as he was the head of the armed forces, he was a very significant person to sign up and support this campaign. And, we went, I remember we all went to see George Osborne in Number 11 and, put the case, Norman putting the case, Alastair and me in our different ways. Yeah. And we managed to get George to include in the autumn statement that year £600 million for, particularly for mental health for younger people. And indeed, I remember I think he mentioned our campaign when he was speaking from the dispatch box in the House of Commons. So that was really how it started and developed. But my role was very subsidiary to Alastair's, who I think understood the terrain that we were entering in order to have effect very much better than I did.
I think you're being a bit harsh on yourself there. I think it was very tripartite. Me Labour, Norman Lib Dem, Andrew a Tory, and I think it was born of the fact that I understood. I've been campaigning on mental health for a long, long time. Yeah. But when it was a very specific target about trying to get more money out of George Osborne, I think we'd both had a sense from George Osborne that he was moderately sympathetic to the cause. And usually when you drill down on that, it's because people have their own experiences and interests and so forth. So Andrew saying that he first got in touch with me because he was going through a very bad spell. And it's really interesting how many Tories have got in touch with me in the past, because they sort of, I think, even though I'm a sort of a hate figure for a lot of Tories, they sort of bit weirdly feel they can trust me. But my interest in mental health goes way, way, way back, because my first experience of it was as a child, not me. We were on holiday in the Hebrides, where my father came from, in Tiree, and I was outside my uncle's house at Little Croft, and opposite, on the croft opposite, somebody was being sectioned. I'll never forget it. It was a crofter called Sydney. And he was being sectioned by the police. And of course, we were just watching as this was all going on. And I was fascinated by it. And then years later, this is so weird. I used to play golf a lot when I was growing up. And I was playing golf in this place called Loch Gilphead in Scotland. And it was Loch Gilphead or Campbelltown, any one of them. And the golf course was adjacent to a mental hospital, psychiatric institution. And there's this guy sitting on the bench at one of these, as we were going around the golf course, and I thought, I know that guy. And it was him. And it's just absolute sort of amazing. So we talked a bit. And then the big thing that happened when I was in my late teens was that my brother, who was in the army, was diagnosed with schizophrenia and invalided out of the army. And then I have a long up and down mental health history, alcohol abuse. I had a psychotic breakdown in the 1980s. And I stopped drinking as a result of that. Didn't drink for 14 years. But I realised that I'd convinced myself that not drinking was all I needed to do, but actually whatever it was that was making me drink was the significant thing, and that was depression. And I only really got properly diagnosed after I left Downing Street. So I sort of lived with it most of the time. And people now think I've always been open about this. I wasn't open in Downing Street, apart from one occasion and then as a result of me talking about it openly, the charity Mind asked me if I would do a magazine feature for the Sunday Times, and I did it. Then I went back to just not talking about it. And then after I left Downing Street, I had probably the worst depression of my life. That went on for quite a few months. That's when I realised I've got to go and see somebody, try and sort it out. And I'm very creative. Stuff that I do and think, it comes out in books. Yeah. And I ended up writing a novel about a psychiatrist who goes crazy. And as a result of that, I just got this urge to do more stuff. I ended up making documentaries and writing another book. And so the campaign, it just sort of evolved. So when the money thing started, I can't remember how specifically we started. I think actually what happened was that one of the charities came to me and said, and we had this discussion and said, look, the best thing to do, and was Norman in government before that?
Yes.
Was he in government then?
I think he wasn't, but he
He'd been
certainly
in
was.
government.
Yes,
He'd
yeah,
been
no,
as-
he was a very, very good public health minister.
And he'd been in the coalition government.
Yes. Yeah.
And then when he came out, I can't remember why he came out of the government, presumably because, of course, the Tories got a majority.
In 15, yeah.
Yeah. So then what happened was we thought, well, Norman's been very, very good on mental health. Three of us got together, and we actually I remember we traipsed around Whitehall together, talking to all sorts of people. But my point is, this is why it's so important people understand this. Yes, I can campaign on my own, and yes, I can get stuff done up to a point. But when you're talking about getting money out of the Treasury, you kind of do need MPs on board. That's why people are very silly when they think, oh, MPs don't do anything, they're all a waste of space. That wouldn't have happened without Andrew and Norman.
Yeah, and we're definitely going to be able to pick up on that point in terms of particularly that, dare I say, the unlikely alliance, but also the way that you have brought together people from all different backgrounds. You know, Andrew, you talked about bringing together an army general, and I think that's what's particularly unique about this campaign. But I wanted to pick up on something you talked about, Alastair, which was, you know, most people that engage in campaign around mental health have a personal experience. And I think it's important to recognise that, you know, for me, reflecting on my experience, one of the times in which I thought about my experience of mental health and how I was handling my mental health was after my father passed when I was quite young. And for me, I took time to actually think about, you know, whether I was having the conversations, whether I was listening to people on it as well. And I guess one thing that often people take inspiration from, and Andrew, you talked about it, is hearing from others talk about their experience about mental health. So, Andrew, you've talked about the importance of Alastair speaking about mental health. And so, Alastair, I wanted to ask you if there is anyone that you heard from specifically that inspired you to talk a little bit more about your mental health or inspired you to campaign on it as well.
It just sort of evolved. I can't think of a specific. When I had my breakdown in the 80s, I found the psychiatrist who looked after me in hospital really impressive. And he sort of gave me a confidence. He was the one he didn't say to me, you're drinking too much, you should stop drinking. He asked me how much I'd been drinking the day before I got admitted to hospital. And it was a lot. It was terrible. I mean, it was actually the penny sort of dropped. I thought, oh, maybe I'm drinking a bit much. But then what happened was, because I was in newspapers I was on the Daily Mirror. I couldn't work for quite a while. But when I went back, even though newspapers, one, it's a heavy drinking environment, but also quite a brutal environment in many ways. But my colleagues were amazing. And that's where I got the confidence to be open, because I thought the only way I can avoid being dragged to the pub is saying, I've been told I can't drink anymore, I can't go to the pub. And with one or two exceptions, everybody respected and accepted that. And the point was, and my boss, I'll talk about two bosses. I think this is why employers are so important. So I'd left the newspaper when I had the breakdown. It wasn't the Mirror, I'll correct myself, I was on Today newspaper when it happened. So when I got out of hospital, and I took a while to recover, but one of the first people to get in touch with me was my old boss at the Mirror, Richard Stott, who had been furious when I'd left the Mirror to go to this other newspaper that was just starting up. Really furious. I mean, never darken my door again. And he was one of the first people to phone me up. And he basically said, I told you it would go tits up. Told you shouldn't have done it. You should never have left here. And you didn't listen to me then, listen to me now. You're going to stay in that hospital for as long as you have to. You're going to do whatever they tell you. You're going to go back to Fiona and make everything up. And when you're fit, you're going to come back here and start at the bottom again. And that was, even telling you that story now, I can feel...
That's a hell of a employer.
Yeah.
And
friends as well.
Yeah, totally.
That frankness is so important. And actually showing, caring and being direct
But it's
as well.
It's more than that. It's actually saying, And this is a message I put out all the time. So there's Andrew, who had one terrible experience when he was being sort of, put through the ringer by the media and the police and all that stuff. And that's, directly/indirectly complicated, but that leads to mental ill health or contributes to mental ill health. And yet that doesn't define his life.
Yeah.
And what Richard was saying to me is, I know who you are, I know what you're good at.
Yeah.
I'm not allowing one episode of mental illness, which may recur. And the thing about, I mentioned my brother Donald, what was amazing, when he died, and this is the reason I campaign, he died 20 years younger than my dad. And that's because of all the antipsychotic drugs he's had to take in all his life, right? And partly, it's not directly attributable, but as soon as he got physically ill, it was much, much harder to fight it. But the thing about Donald is that he'd been in the Scots Guards. He was a brilliant musician, bagpiper like me. I'm not saying I'm brilliant. I'm saying I'm a piper. But he was brilliant. He was really, really good. Made a life out of that to some extent. Ended up becoming the official piper to Glasgow University with a sort of a side job, which was meant to be his main job, which was a security guard. And he held that down with a really serious mental illness for 27 years. Why? Because they never defined him as a schizophrenic. No. They knew he had schizophrenia, and they knew that sometimes when he felt well, he stopped taking the medication. And then they'd manage it. What they wouldn't do is say, he's too much trouble, we'll get rid of him. And I think employers are so important in this.
Yeah.
And I was lucky with Tony Blair as well. Tony knew that I had a history, and he knew that I'd had, he knew I was quite a difficult character to deal with at times. But he wasn't going to let it define me either.
And I think that's really important, and I see that's why both of you, together with Norman Lamb, place such importance on creating that wider coalition in respect of the campaign. I want to take a step back a little bit, because this is, as we've all talked about, an unlikely alliance. And on the face of it, it might not necessarily seem so. We're a short distance from Parliament, which is fair to say both of you have spent a significant part of your careers, and both were very senior in the world of politics. Both went to Cambridge, and not to give away your ages, you are probably of similar age as well. You're
68.
You're similar ages. But I think if we dig a little bit deeper, there are moments of divergence. And so, Andrew, in a debate in Cambridge in 2012, you mentioned that, I paraphrase a little bit, that the Labour government was a factor in Brexit. And anyone that's heard Alastair speak for more than 2 minutes will know how much of a raw nerve that is. And similarly, Alastair, you described the David Cameron government as austerity measures playing a huge factor in terms of mental health provision, in terms of the NHS more widely. Now, the reason why I highlight that is because I'm interested, that first conversation you had, were you aware of those comments? Did you have an impression about the other member? How did you approach that first conversation around the campaign?
It is true that politics is antagonistic. Most of my colleagues on either side don't have many friendships which cross over the aisle. But I've never really been that sort of a politician, and I have many. I won't embarrass them by naming. I have quite a lot of friends who were part of the New Labour.
Well, we've got a very close mutual friend. Charlie Fortner is a very close friend of both of us.
Yes, absolutely.
In very different ways.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And there are others. There are others as well, which I won't name for fear of embarrassing. But the point is that because he and I disagree on issues in politics, that is not, that for me would not affect our underlying relationship and friendship. And to your earlier comments, I was very fortunate, because when I was suffering from very severe depression, first of all, talking to Alastair made me more willing to open up, because I wasn't at all willing to do that before. And secondly, I'm lucky enough to have a wonderful wife who's also a very, very experienced doctor and GP. And so she said at one point, you need help, and I'm going to fix it. And because she is GP who knew her way around the system very well, I got help, and that help was, for me, was pivotal and brought me out of it. So I was, for those two things, I was really extremely fortunate. But I think that you can have political disagreements. In the old days, it used to happen when Gladstone and Macmillan were taking chunks out of each other in the chamber. there are stories about them meeting behind the Speaker's chair and Macmillan saying to Gladstone, God, you were hard on me in there, come and have a drink, and taking him back to the Prime Minister's office for a drink. So I don't think the fact that you have political differences need define a friendship. I think it's much more your values and the relationship you have, the shared background, those sort of things which determine.
So is this the modern day Gladstone and Macmillan? Is that what it is?
No,
I'll tell you what.
I'll tell you what. I think what's interesting as well is that I got to know Andrew first really when he was an MP and I was a journalist. I mean, that's when we've talked a lot. And that was because I used to, the members' lobby that Andrew, I can't believe he's still there, but there are a number of statues there. And I know. And I always used to spend half of my working day standing at Clement Attlee's feet. It was a very deliberate signal. I'm the Labour guy here. There's Churchill over there, but here's Clement Attlee, and that's where I did most of my work there. And it was right by the main door. You know when you see on the television where they now let the cameras into the central lobby? So if Andrew or somebody's coming down, I can see them coming, and then I can nobble them if I want to talk to them. And Andrew, you see, the other thing about relationships in Parliament, this goes to journalism as well. Everybody knows, every Tory knew that I worked for a newspaper that was passionately pro-Labour and anti-Tory. But you can build relationships where people still respect you enough and trust you enough to talk to you. And know that, and you can, there is a lot of gossip goes on. And I don't mean gossip as in, who's doing what to whom. I mean, somebody expressing an opinion, say about a colleague, that you won't go off and say, Andrew Mitchell just called a colleague a prick. But you just, that's...
Not that I ever would.
No, not that you ever did, obviously, no.
So I'd be walking past and Alastair would hail me from the feet of Clement Attlee and we'd go over and gossip. And if I said something that was disobliging about the government at the time, of course I would be...
Which government are we talking about?
We're talking about the Thatcher Major government.
Thatcher Major, yeah.
So if I said something disobliging, I would be elevated in Alastair's column. So I would then be a senior Tory who said so-and-so, or a Tory,
respectable,
even a Tory grandee who said such thing. And that would fill his column.
Eventually he may have become a former minister.
No, I think it's really important to highlight that, because far too often, actually, and this is what we're seeking to highlight, far too often in politics and elsewhere, there are forces and individuals who would seek to divide and actually say that politicians don't all get along. But actually, you're highlighting that it's not just the case.
Also we on the second most popular podcast in the country, the rest is politics after this one, obviously. But we had George Mitchell on, who was the Bill Clinton's Northern Ireland peace envoy. And there was a time when he was the Democrat leader in the Senate, and he told us this story about when he first got elevated to that position. Very young, I think he was probably late 30s, early 40s. And Bob Dole was the Republican leader. And he wrote to him, and he told us about this letter, and he said, I just want you to know about how I intend to operate. I think this institution will work better if you and I have good relations. I will never speak ill of you. I will never call you, I will never say that you said something untrue. He just went through these things. And he said they ended up having lunch or dinner every single week.
Oh, wow.
And they were on opposite sides, so they'd go into Congress and they'd be tearing lumps off each other. Now, there's part of people that might think, that sounds a bit hypocritical.
No.
But actually, they believe fundamentally different things, but they were able to discuss them in a way that wasn't offensive. And I think if you're growing up today, let's be honest, even in Britain, the most prominent politician in Britain right now is Donald Trump. Yeah. And if you believe that's what politics is about, then we shouldn't be surprised if the next generation decides, I want nothing to do with that.
And that's the huge risk, and hopefully this discussion highlights actually that we can, working together, be able to achieve and campaign on the big issues. And
I think it's interesting that the public don't like to think that we're all chums together at Westminster. No, they don't like that. No. But equally, when they hear on any questions or question time, something like that, where politicians agree on a point of principle, they do like that. They do like that, and they then take a different view. They then say, rather than all this noise and name calling and so on, how good it is to find politicians who will agree on a point of principle. But we're all in a position where we are making our point and standing up for what we think. And that's important because then when you do agree, it's much more powerful as a unifying point.
So on a Equality for Mental Health campaign that you worked on, I'm keen because one of the things of real strength was the ability to unite both celebrities, GPs, politicians, NHS trusts, a number of people. How did you go about doing that? And, you know, what were some of the lessons in doing that as well?
I think the most important thing is to have a lot of names in your phone book. And, you know, be sparing about it. Look, I know as somebody who is, like today, I've been asked to give quotes for the cover of 3 books, having previously done.
You should be more sparing.
Well, I am quite sparing because I think you can sell yourself a bit thin.
He very kindly endorsed my book, which is still available at good bookshops.
I did. And I also read it before I did it as well, which often you don't even bother to read. Yeah, say what you want. But then the other thing is you get asked to contribute financially or with time endlessly to every cause going, okay? And so you've got to be sparing. But I basically, that sort of thing where I felt we were sort of, the door was opening and we could push it. And it was really just a question of reaching out to as many people. In the end, the big driver of that was, I think it was, we gave it to the Daily Telegraph as a way, again, because we were speaking to, George Osborne was the audience, as it were. And we got this huge roster of names.
200 apparently.
And it was serious people. We actually, there were some names came and said, no, not well known enough, or not serious enough, or not important.
I'm not going to ask who was put in the list of not well known.
Quite a few.
No, but I remember this very well. So basically, the address book was Alastair's, but he would then say to me and Norman, we haven't got anyone in this particular space. Do you know so and so? So I think, to be fair to Alastair, it was Alastair's got the bulk of the names, and we added in things that I think also added value to that list. And the article that the Telegraph wrote, with the very, very broad spread of people supporting this, I hope and believe was a real breakthrough.
Oh, it was.
In getting through to the general
Come on,
public.
there must have been some stories as you pulled the list of 200 people together. Was it quite straightforward?
Yeah.
Was it quite tricky?
No, and I think the other thing about those things, you know, there's a lesson in campaigning for this. Get some really good names right from the word go.
Yeah.
And then once you can tell somebody who might be
You want to name someone?
No, once you can define somebody, let's say somebody who's B-list, okay? You tell them that you're going to be on a list with 4 A-listers, then they're more likely to say yes. And so then you spread it out. And then the other thing, the great thing about the online world, there's a lot of downsides to the whole kind of internet thing. But the upside is that once the Telegraph ran that story, and they obviously didn't mention every single name, but then you have the capacity, and I just brought somebody in for a couple of days to do this, is you take name number 133 on the list. Where are they from? Yorkshire. What about getting a piece in the Yorkshire Post? What's their speciality? Horticulture. What about seeing a BBC gardening programme will take something? You know, so you get that as your kind of your base, and then you let the flowers bloom, as it were.
So, bring it to present day, and you know, as you both highlighted, there were some great successes with the campaign. Saw increase in awareness, and also, Andrew, as you talked about, increase in funding as well. But if we do look 10 years on in a 23-24 budget, obviously budget's being constrained. The portion of the money going towards mental health in the NHS budget is still a fraction of the NHS budget. So I wanted to think about, and I wanted to get your thoughts as to, if you were to set up the campaign today, or what would you focus on? Do you feel the funding is still the big issue, or do you see awareness still being a wider issue as well? And I'll start off with you, Andrew.
Well, I think if we were doing it again, we'd do it in more or less the same way, I think. But we have to recognise that, particularly after COVID, there's been quite a big increase. I think that over recent years, there's been a lot more work done on helping in schools, particularly teenagers and teenage girls, assisting them. So I think helping at an earlier stage is very important. As you rightly say, the competition for funding now is very great. We have a completely different situation internationally, and we need to massively increase our spending on defence. That's going to skew budgets inevitably now. And I think the main job of the sort of campaign that Alastair and I were involved in before, and Alastair devised, is to make sure the importance is understood. So one would be arguing with Wes Streeting as well as with the Chancellor of the Exchequer about the importance of ensuring that the money is defined for mental health and not spread elsewhere, so that it's very carefully defined and also that it's spent extremely well.
I mean, if I look back, we were obviously very, very happy that the campaign led to George Osborne making the announcement that he did. I'm not sure the money ever had the impact. I'm not sure the money ever went to where we thought it should. I'm not even sure that the money actually ever got properly allocated. I don't know that, but health, it's an easy thing to say, but then once you're running the health service, actually following the pounds as where they go is sometimes quite difficult. So I'm not doubting his commitment. I'm not doubting it was a very large sum of money at the time. But I sort of feel on the big picture that we've gone forward on attitudes and we've gone backwards on services. And I think we're in a bad place now. And I think if you were to run a campaign, and also I wouldn't underestimate, I say this as a lifelong Labour person, it's probably easier to campaign against the Tory government on something like this than it is against the Labour government. But I think we're not far off the point where we're going to need another sort of campaign to do something like this, because the fact is that budgets are very tight. The rhetoric around the health service is unsurprisingly about waiting lists, because that's the big thing that Labour campaigned on, said that they get down. That's what they want to be judged on. But I worry that the mental health aspect of the health debate is getting squeezed again. And so I think if you did a campaign now, I think the principles would be the same as Andrew says. But I think you probably do need to have a very basic kind of, we've got to go again. Do we really have to keep doing this? Because I think that's where we're at.
So the reason one of my two things of being very sharp about spending is precisely because of what Alastair said, because I think we talked about this at the time and wanted to know where the money had gone. And the money undoubtedly went into the NHS. The 600 million certainly did. But for example, in my constituency in Sutton Coldfield, where we had, when I first became the Member of Parliament there in 2001, we had very, very scant mental health services in the constituency, and I campaigned hard to increase that long before we got involved in our campaign. But what I discovered when I drilled down was that the money had not gone all as new money. Some of it had been used to pay off overspends in other areas. So I wanted to know how much had gone into Sutton Coldfield, and I discovered that it had been paying off overspends elsewhere, which was quite wrong. So I think my learning from that was you've got to really follow the money and be very sharp that it is spent on new facilities, new services, and dealing with new clients.
So it's almost a campaign which also it raises the importance, but hasn't ability to follow the money, ability to measure how the money is spent as well.
Yeah,
I guess something to think about.
There are parliamentary bodies whose job that is. I mean, select committees do it. The National Audit Office does it. But in terms of campaigning, it's difficult. I mean, the charities don't have the capacity really to work out where every penny in government money is going. So I think, I think we made a lot of progress on many fronts, but I worry at the moment we're going backwards. I also think within the media debate, Andrew's right that COVID actually seems to have. One of the reasons we're talking about, the government's talking about bringing down welfare spending is because COVID has led to a lot of people feeling they can't face work and all these other issues that are going on. Social media and spread of anxiety, particularly amongst young people, I think is a real thing, which I don't think we fully understand yet. So all of this is part of the mental health space. But what it means is that there's a danger it just gets fragmented. And I think if you're campaigning, the most important thing is you're clear about what you want to campaign for. I was hoping that the campaign on attitudes had finished. We don't need to do that anymore. But with what's happening in America right now, I think we're being pushed back. The fact that they're basically throwing out DEI, the fact that they've turned woke into sort of one of the biggest swear words in the world, when actually all woke means is that you want to be alert and alive to injustices. Well, mental health, as Theresa May rightly said on the steps of Downing Street, she said it's one of the great unspoken injustices.
I just want to pick up on that because we're recording this shortly after the scenes that many people would have seen internationally in the Oval Office with both Trump and President Zelensky as well. And actually, Alastair, you talked about this earlier in terms of young people growing up today. What are they going to be seen in terms of examples of unlikely alliances, people coming together? And I wanted to ask you both, what do you think it is possible, fast forward in 10 years from when you run that campaign, to run a similar style campaign? Or do you feel actually society is becoming ever more fragmented and the people that are seeking to sow division, it'll be much more difficult to develop the kind of campaign you developed 10 years ago?
Well, I think how you do the campaign depends on the contours of the landscape which you are addressing. So if we did it again today, I think it would be different. I think the point that Alastair makes about the attitudinal shift, I do think we made big inroads into that, hence the sort of General Richards and the breadth of the 200 people and so on. But life moves on, the circumstances have changed, some of which you've alluded to today. So it would be different. But I hope that if we or others were to do it, they would zero in on the advantages that we managed to exploit, partly because of Alastair's address book, but also because we had the right hook at the time, and we had a sympathetic Chancellor of the Exchequer who would listen, and then decided that we were right, and decided that he should come forward with a sizable amount of money, notwithstanding that not all of it went to the right place, but a substantial amount of money to try and move the dial.
I've just remembered, by the way, because Andrew said that on his way here he was talking to Jeremy Hunt, and he actually played a role in this as well, that I've just remembered, was that I wrote a book about a novel, but the theme was mental health. And Jeremy Hunt read it and then called me in for a chat when he was health secretary. And looking back, I think he was kind of co-opting me in the campaign for more money for the health service, looking back.
Well, he very successfully got £20 billion of extra funding.
So I think if you did a campaign now, I mean, look, I do campaign now, but it's maybe a little less organised. I still stay very close to the charities, particularly to Mind and to Rethink Mental Illness. Every time I bump into Wes Streeting, I say to him, this is not going where it should be. Likewise, I had a meeting recently at the Health Department with Stephen Kinnock, who's the Minister for Health and Social Care, and Gillian Merrin in the Lords, who's the Mental Health Minister in the Lords. So you just have to keep making the argument. But I sort of feel at the moment, even though it's become a given that people feel they can talk about it more openly, I notice when I go to talk at conferences about this, when you come to famous people, it's still a very small number of people. If I go get one more invitation saying, we've already got Ruby Wax and Stephen Fry and Frank Bruno lined up, right? It's like, okay, there we go. Yeah, we're good. Let's have another, get the band back together, as it were. So I still don't think we've totally normalised it, and I think for young people in particular, there's a disconnect between the debate that our generation is having about mental health and the way that they're maybe thinking about it as well.
And before I come on to the final question, I wanted to pick up on that point. There are young people listening to this podcast, and they're thinking about setting up a campaign. They're thinking about setting up a campaign with an unlikely alliance. Somebody who may not share same political beliefs, different backgrounds. What would be your advice to them to setting up a campaign or a business or a project that they're passionate about?
Well, they're quite right, first of all, to make it as broad as possible. But I think they also have to be very clear what they're trying to do. So we were very, very clear that our key message, succinct message, was physical ill health and mental health are two sides of the same coin. They're not different. They're both ill health, and they've both got to be tackled. And I think that was very important to have that quite sharp edge to it and get the broadest possible coalition to pile in on that point. So those are the two ingredients I think that they would, in my view, they would need to focus on.
I guess I would agree with that. And a different way of putting it, I have this motto, which actually comes from a poem written by Marilyn Monroe, which is "Think in ink." I see you're a pen and ink person. Write down what your campaign is. What if you've only got one word for your campaign? What is it? If you've only got a sentence, what is it? What are you actually trying to achieve? And I think I see some great campaigns on mental health in schools. Where kids are saying to the teachers, we want to be able to change the way that the school is run. We want to have spaces where we can go when we're feeling stressed, whatever it might be. And they campaign for it. Yeah. And I've seen that being done successfully because at the top, there's an understanding that this will be good for the school as a whole. So I think that the most important thing, though, is you've really, really, really got to care about it. You've really got to believe in it. You've got to know your facts. And you've got to just live it. You've got to, the way to get the sort of, Andrew mentioned, getting the head of the army. I can't remember how. Did he phone him up? Did he just bump into him?
He's a very good and very helpful to me in my political work.
Right.
But he's cross-party stuff on development. No, I mean he's a very good friend, and he didn't take much persuasion.
No.
But he saw the point, and he then said yes. And actually, having David Richards on board. I think was important to us.
Yeah. And so we had, there's some people you'd say, well, you're obviously going to get them, maybe religious figures or medical figures or whatever. But it's sort of thinking beyond that. So when I'm in a campaign mode, I don't miss anybody. I'll think, I wonder if they could help. What could they do? What could they do? You've got to have that mindset. And it's the most important thing is to have that clarity about what it is you're trying to achieve.
I absolutely agree in terms of that clarity of thought and clarity of what you are trying to achieve. Now, I know this is the question that, Andrew and Alastair, you've both been waiting for. And there's nothing that unifies unlikely alliances than songs and music. And so for the final question for this show and episode is, what karaoke song would illustrate your unlikely alliance? Who wants to go first?
It's not what we want.
No, it's what would illustrate your unlikely alliance?
Well, if I'm to go first on this, I would
feel free.
I would say I think the theme song from The Odd Couple would probably be one way of doing it.
Yes,
and maybe our very different politics. Maybe Ebony and Ivory.
Okay.
But yes. I thought, given we're talking about mental health and the difference, I thought perhaps maybe Bridge Over Troubled Waters. But
you've been given this. You've been given this ahead of time.
No, I read the brief. I read the brief.
Was this the brief?
Yes, it was.
But my final one is definitely the Odd Couple theme song.
I can't.
I'm not sure you could top that, to be honest.
Was this on the brief?
Yes, it was.
Or actually, with a little help from my friends.
With a
That's
little
not
help.
bad.
I like
That's
that.
pretty
With
good.
a little help from my
That's pretty
friends.
good. Oh my lord! What about
Over to you, Alastair.
When You Walk?
Oh yes.
How about You'll Never Walk Alone?
Yes, that is a
That's
good
not
one.
bad, is it?
That is a good
very
one.
good.
And also, that's a
one.
good karaoke song.
Yes.
Everybody knows it. Everybody can sing it.
Everyone
No,
knows it.
when I very quickly skimmed over the brief, I thought you meant this your favourite karaoke song. Full stop.
Oh, yeah. We could be here all day. We
I
could be here all day.
I saw the word karaoke and the red light started to flash.
Yeah, I think Andrew wins that
very
one.
old school.
Yeah.
And on that note, Alastair, Andrew, thank you so much for joining on the Unlikely Alliance podcast, and look forward to hopefully speaking again soon.